Some encouraging words there from Leo Varadkar after 3 years of very little happening. What are the odds of something happening with just 3 weeks to go?
Well, he did say over the coming weeks. So the coming weeks could mean 10, 15, 20 weeks. I agree with that. Was kind of optimistic, although we've not actually heard what the basis for agreement is. There's speculation in the English press that maybe Boris Johnson bent his knee. Well, the question then is, somebody has had to give somewhere, and we're not clear who that is. And obviously then the question is, if Boris does do that, could he actually pass such an agreement through the House of Commons? So there's still many days to go, and we will probably be talking on this endlessly. But I think it's on a Saturday to come from, I think, the third time ever, the Parliament is going to meet and decide essentially whether whether they're going to agree to anything and whether there will be an extension. So I think the probability is that there will still be another extension. But, I mean, who knows? Maybe this is progress. It's the first bit of good news, I think, that anyone much has heard for many, many, many months.
Yeah, that Irish border question has been a major sticking point. What does an Irish border that is acceptable to all sides look like?
The answer is I don't really know. And I'm actually headed to Dublin on November the 7th, and I'm going to drive up to Belfast. So I'm going to actually find out what that border looks like. I mean, the crucial thing is when you do that, there is no border there. That's the big deal. And the possibility of a hard border is really the thing that's holding these talks back. And the talk that perhaps there'll be institutions that several miles back from the border, that's a border. It is remarkable when you go there, and I was there in the past when all the troubles were there. That what's happened is the lack of border has brought peace in Ireland, and so rightly, nobody really seems to want to get rid of that. So the sticking point is, what do you do about Northern Ireland? How do you keep that free border open? And the problem is if you give some special arrangement, let's say down the Irish Sea, especially the Scots say they want independence, and there was a giant demonstration in Edinburgh the other day. 250,000 people showed up calling for Scottish independence. So if you find a deal in Ireland, you may well have really lots of problems in Scotland and even in Wales. And there's even rumblings to say London will like it too.
So, Danny, the UK had 1 quarter of negative growth, contracting 0.2% in the second quarter. Now, you just wrote an opinion piece saying that, in fact, the UK is already in recession. Why?
Well, the data that I like to look at is really a whole series of data files that actually flashed red around January 2008 and told us that the recession was there. So what sort of data am I talking about? Purchasing manager indexes, the Bank of England agents, business and consumer scores are really been flashing red for quite a long time. And the problem, it turned out, in 2008 was that data revisions actually were the thing that eventually showed us when recession was, particularly in the second quarter of 2008. In July 2008, we got a number much like this of plus 0.2 for the second quarter, and then the data went into revisions. And we know today actually the answer was minus 0.7. So I think what happens at a turning point is that these authorities get it wrong. They're too optimistic as the economy turns down. You need to look at other indicators. So if 2008 is anything to go by, every one of the indicators that were flashing in the early spring of 2008 are flashing again now, and that's the concern. And if we look back at the data that we've been looking at today, you didn't know it really until a year later that the UK had entered the worst recession ever. So I think you shouldn't read too much into the GDP data. You should look at these surveys, and they are all flashing, saying the UK's in recession. And that's what I wrote in The Guardian last week.
Does that mean that the Bank of England should be doing more at this point?
Well, I think it probably does. And I think the first indicator of that was probably the biggest hawk on the Monetary Policy Committee, Michael Saunders, who's voted for rate increases several times, actually made a speech last night, about a few days ago, actually, saying that he thought the next move was probably down. So I think you're probably going to see over the next few weeks, especially if we see more on the Brexit front. But I think the answer is that the MPC is going to have to at least get ahead of the game if it could. I mean, remember that in 2008, the MPC hadn't actually spotted the recession was coming. 6 months after it had started, they still hadn't spotted it. Well, some of us had, but the majority of the committee hadn't.
Governor Mark Carney has ruled out going sub-zero. He's talked about that being a little bit unnatural. If there's a no-deal Brexit, would that be a scenario that the BOE has to look at?
Well, I think it's pretty foolish to rule it out, especially as other central banks around the world, the ECB, we know, recently cut from -0.4 to -0.5 in its major rate. I mean, the question is, it's pretty hard for Mark Carney to rule it out. Well, we don't even know if he'll be there. He may actually be there. We know that there's some talk that he might have to stay on for a while. I don't think you can rule it out. There isn't a lot of leeway for the central bank to go with rates at 0.75. Obviously, they can cut to zero, but the question is, could they cut further? What QE could they do? But I think the other part of it relates to our earlier conversation. What happened in 2008 was you have to have the fiscal authorities doing things. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has to pass things through the Houses of Parliament. And actually, it's certainly unclear that they could do that. They haven't, to this point, passed anything. They don't have a majority in the House of Commons. So the pressure on the central bank is probably going to be immense because Sajid Javid, the new Chancellor, may not be able to actually get anything through the House of Commons. So I think it would be foolish to rule it out. And Mark Carney oftentimes in the past has given forward guidance. And the listeners to this program around the world realize that that forward guidance didn't work very well. I'm not saying you should go to negative rates right now, but you certainly shouldn't rule it out. And we'll have to see. But the problem is there ain't many arrows left in the quiver, either on the monetary front or the fiscal front, after a decade of slow growth, with interest rates still so low.